would. By the time Eugene's family moved in, the yard was a tangled mass of weeds the father had spent several days. But after meeting Eugene, I began to think of the present more than of the future. What I wanted now was to enter that house I had watched for so many years. I wanted American history. By the time Eugene's family moved in, but after meeting Eugene, I began to think in the next 30 minutes I changed clothes, put on a little pink lipstick, and got my books together. Then I went in to tell my mother that I was going to a friend's house to study. I did not expect her reaction. "You're going out today?" The way she said "today" sounded as if a storm warning had been issued. It was said in utter disbelief. Before I could answer, she came toward me and held my elbows as I clutched my books. "Hija, the president has been killed. We must show respect. He was a great man. Come to church with me tonight." She tried to embrace me, but my books were in the way. My first impulse was to comfort her. She seemed so distraught, but I had to meet Eugene in 15 minutes. "I have a test to study for, Mama. I will be home by 8. "You are forgetting who you are, Niña. I have seen you staring down at that boy's house. You are heading for humiliation and pain." My mother said this in Spanish, and in a resigned tone that surprised me, as if she had no intention of stopping me from heading for humiliation and pain. I started for the door. She sat in front of the TV holding a white handkerchief to her face. I walked out to the street and around the chain-link fence that separated El building from Eugene's house. The yard was neatly edged around the little walk that led to the door. It always amazed me how Patterson, the inner core of the city, had no apparent logic to its architecture. Small, neat, single residences like this one could be found right next to huge, dilapidated apartment buildings like El building. My guess was that the little houses had been there first. Then the immigrants had come in droves, and the monstrosities had been raised for them. The Italians, the Irish, the Jews, and now us, the Puerto Ricans and the blacks. The door was painted a deep green. Verde, the color of hope. I had heard my mother say it. Verde esperanza. I knocked softly. A few suspenseful moments later, the door opened just a crack. The red, swollen face of a woman appeared. She had a halo of red hair floating over a delicate ivory face, the face of a doll, with freckles on the nose. Her smudged eye makeup made her look unreal to me, like a mannequin seen through a warped store window. "What do you want?" Her voice was tiny and sweet-sounding, like a little girl's, but her tone was not friendly. "I'm Eugene's friend. He asked me over to study." I thrust out my books, a silly gesture that embarrassed me almost immediately. "You live there?" She pointed up to El building, which looked particularly ugly, like a gray prison with as many dirty windows and rusty fire escapes. The woman had stepped halfway out, and I could see that she wore a white nurse's uniform with St. Joseph's Hospital on the name tag. "Yes, I do." She looked intently at me for a couple of heartbeats, then said as if to herself, "I don't know how you people do it." Then directly to me, "Listen, honey, Eugene doesn't want to study with you. He's a smart boy, doesn't need help. You understand me? I am truly sorry if he told you you could come over. He cannot study with you. It's nothing personal. You understand? We won't be in this place much longer. No need for him to get close to people. You'll just make it harder for him later. Run back home now." I couldn't move. I just stood there in shock at hearing these things said to me in such a honey-drenched voice. I had never heard an accent like hers, except for Eugene's softer version. It was as if she were singing me a little song. "What's wrong? Didn't you hear what I said?" She seemed very angry, and I finally snapped out of my trance. I turned away from the green door and heard her close it gently. Our apartment was empty when I got home. My mother was in someone else's kitchen, seeking the solace she needed. Father would come in from his late shift at midnight. I would hear them talking softly in the kitchen for hours that night. They would not discuss their dreams for the future or life in Puerto Rico, as they often did. That night, they would talk sadly about the young widow and her 2 children, as if they were family. For the next few days, we would observe luto in our apartment. That is, we would practice restraint and silence, no loud music or laughter. Some of the women of El Building would wear black for weeks. That night, I lay in my bed trying to feel the right thing for our dead president. But the tears that came up from a deep source inside me were strictly for me. When my mother came to the door, I pretended to be sleeping. Sometime during the night, I saw from my bed the street light come on. It had a pink halo around it. I went to my window and pressed my face to the cool glass. Looking up at the light, I could see the white snow falling like a lace veil over its face. I did not look down to see it turning gray as it touched the ground below.
Now, one of the great things about great stories is that often the author will say things without saying them. I would write that down at 2B. Saying things without saying them. In other words, this is going to be a story where we're going to have all kinds of information where things are going to be understood by both the character in the story, as well as, of course, you, the reader. So as we get into this story, we're going to find ourselves asking, again, the question about the title, American and the word history. Of course, everything about this story is understood by its internal kind of 2 stories. So let's write this down already at level 1. We really don't have one story here. We have 2 stories, don't we? In other words, the way history works is when something really important happens, that's one story. That is to say, the killing, the assassination of President Kennedy. So that's a story. And there's no question that that's a story within this story. But then there's a second story, isn't there? That is to say, the normal lives of people that have to keep kind of going even when the first story becomes a major moment. Of course, our story is going to unfold here with all kinds of early recognitions, right? So as we go into the text itself, let's pay attention to the beautiful way in which Judith Ortiz Cofer is going to tell the story of Elena. Now, right away, the setting matters on page 241, so let's start there. In our setting, we are told where we are. We are in Paterson, New Jersey. We are in a neighborhood that is going to have all kinds of different types of races of people. We will have different nationalities of people. In other words, can we say it this way? The neighborhood where Elena lives is going to kind of be a microcosm of America, right? We have all these different kind of cultures that cohabitate, all right? Of course, it will be that cohabitation, that living together, that will be the source of the major tension that will be provided in the form of an epiphany at the end of the story. Number 2, on page 241. In the exposition part of our story, not only is there setting, there's also time. So we're going to find out that this story is going to be set on the day President Kennedy was shot. Again, the 22nd of November, 1963, right? She begins by telling us a little bit about the day Kennedy was shot, starting on 242. And they were at school, she says, right? Of course, right away, you've got an interesting indicator of how this story is going to be about different elements of what it means to be an American. Notice, for example, for her, as a young Puerto Rican girl, she envies the black girls, she says, who are so able to kind of do the kinds of jump roping that she can't do. So right away, the story is already setting us up to this notion of what the great French writer de Tocqueville called America as a melting pot. Now, that has always been a much debated metaphor, but let's put it in our notes nonetheless. De Tocqueville said in his famous Democracy in America that America is this country where you have all of these different cultures that seek to cohabitate. De Tocqueville said that's one of the things that made America great. The idea obviously is, well, in our story, how do all of those different cultures cohabitate? And early on we have an indication of this, notice, from Elena, who says, man, I wish I wish I could jump rope like these girls. And they don't seem to be cold all the time like I am. She says, I hate this cold. It's terrible. She says it. Notice on page 242, 3 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs down. I hated, she says, the city, especially in winter. I hated public school number 13. I hated my skinny, flat-chested body. And I envied the black girls who could jump rope so fast that their legs became a blur. They always seemed to be warm while I froze. Notice the repetition of the word hated at 2b. What is significant about that word, hated? Of course, we're going to recognize this is a story about racism. Let's say it out loud. That will be the epiphany at the end of the story. What is racism? Well, of course, it's hate without a real cause. So the repetition of the word hate here early on in our story is going to set us up to get ready for the other kinds of hate that we're going to see in this story. Notice then the introduction of the other character, Eugene. Some have said this is an interesting love story. Some have pointed out at 3A, some freshmen have pointed out, that when we read Romeo and Juliet, we're going to read a story, a play, about 2 young people who fall in love or are attracted to each other, and the cultures that they come out of don't allow them to be together, and it frustrates both of them. We're going to obviously see this game played here as well. Some have pointed out that Eugene is introduced here, but we won't see Eugene later in the story, right? Notice that when Elena comes to her epiphany, Eugene is nowhere around, right? Let's go ahead and pay attention now to Eugene. And let's pay attention as well to the fact that Elena is defined as a watcher. Right? Watcher. She's always looking. She's always watching. Notice she watches at school, but more significantly, she watches from the building she lives in, L building. From the fire escape up high. The building is built up high. Eugene, of course, lives in the only house in the neighborhood. And notice that the setting is a big part of this story. Why? Because the building that she lives in is going to cast a shadow on the house, which is the only house that's there, right? She's a watcher, we're told, of cultures. Notice she'll watch a Jewish culture. So already, notice again, the story is telling us about the fabric. By the way, if de Tocqueville's word picture is a pot, a melting pot, then the other word picture that's so popular is, of course, a quilt, right? The patchwork quilt, where we have different kinds of pieces of material that come together to make a quilt, right? So the same idea, right? She, of course, will tell us that we're in a little bit of a flashback away from the 22nd of November, the day of the Kennedy assassination. She will tell us a little bit of backstory. Well, what is that backstory? Well, she started watching. She likes to look down from her fire escape, right? And to kind of look in, almost like a voyeur of a type, right? It's not that she's necessarily spying, but she's watching. And as she watches, she learns different things. Of course, the old man that she enjoyed watching dies in June. Remember, we're in November, so notice how very subtly she gives us a sense of timing, right? Okay, so in other words, from June to November, we've got a certain period of time there when obviously all the other stuff will transpire with Eugene. There was Eugene, we're told. What do we know about Eugene on 244? Well, he's in honors classes. There's some subtle, brilliant writing. Watch this on page 244. Read it with me. The last paragraph on 244. Once school started, remember, from June to the beginning of school, roughly, we would say September, right? Once school started, I looked for Eugene in all my classes. But PS 13 was a huge, overpopulated place. In other words, don't think about this school the way you would think about, for example, your school. There will be possibly over 1,000 students or more in a school like this. And so it's very easy to not see Eugene, right? Notice she tells us, it took me days and many discrete questions to discover that Eugene was in honors classes for all his subjects. So let's put it in our notes right away. What we know about Eugene is he's well educated, he's brilliant, he's intelligent, right? Keep reading. Classes that were not open to me because English was not my first language, though I was a straight A student. And this is, of course, a very subtle way to begin to introduce distinctions that are drawn, even in school sometimes, between students simply because of language Even though she was a straight A student, she's not allowed in honors classes because English is not her first subject. Now, of course, today we read a story like this and we're like, are you serious? How is that possible? Of course, remember your date, 1963. In other words, reading the story will teach you about American history. There was a time in America when only certain students of a certain skin color could even go to school together. Then there was a time when certain students who spoke certain languages or didn't speak English were not allowed to take an honors class. In other words, America looks different today than it did back then. That's one of the clear points our story wants to make. In other words, you can learn a lot about American history by reading American history. This story, right? Notice we continue, right? I managed to, quote unquote, run into him. She approaches him. He's a little more shy. He's a little more withdrawn. And, importantly, for later in our story, he talks funny. He talks funny. He talks with a kind of strange accent. He speaks English, but he speaks English because he actually is not from New Jersey. He actually is from a state called Georgia, which we think of course, as down in the South, right? Their first meeting, right? Notice she asks him, you're Eugene, aren't you, right? Of course, immediately there's some discussion about where she lives, right? She says it, or he points out, the first insight, I noticed that L building blocked most of the sun. I'm on 245, right? And that the only spot that got a little sunlight during the day was the tiny square of earth that the old woman had planted with flowers. This is a significant symbol, so let's write it down. That building, L building, becomes a symbol in our story of the ways in which the sunlight gets blocked out of, right? In other words, that building represents the change that inevitably kind of happens, right, within American history. And, of course, a little tiny square of light, right? Notice she says, I didn't tell Eugene I could see inside his kitchen from his bedroom. I felt dishonest, she says, but I liked my secret sharing. By the way, the great writer Conrad has a story called Secret Sharer. This notion of she engages in a life without letting anybody know that she engages in this life, right? Mother is going to call out Elena, telling her she's acting moody, telling her that there's something wrong with her, right? And then she breaks away for a little bit and tells us on 245 that on Sundays, she said, every Sunday, we drove out to the suburbs of Patterson, Clifton and Passing, out to where people mowed grass on Sundays in the summer, where children made snowmen in the winter from pure white snow, not like the gray slush of Patterson which seemed to fall from the sky in that view. I had learned to listen to my parents' dreams, which were spoken in Spanish, raising two issues for our notes right away. One, obviously the issue of what is a home. Is a home an apartment? Or is a home where you live and you can mow a lawn and children can play outside and it's safe and the snow is clean snow, white, as opposed to it falling in the city because of all the smog, it turns yucky brown and all of that. Number two, notice Elena will introduce, Judith Cofer will introduce the idea of dreams. The dreams are spoken in Spanish, but she can hear those dreams. The quest, of course, is to find a home, to somehow have a future. Notice on 246, her dream, Elena's dream, is to go to college and to become a teacher, right? There will then be this notion of the present is more important for her, however, than the future. And after she met Eugene, all she cares about on 246 is to try and be with him. She wants to befriend him. She likes him. Notice the interesting idea that she's learning to read Gone with the Wind, which is a novel, a very famous novel, about the American Civil War. And it's set in the South, and it tells about the fall of the famous famous city, right? And the whole notion of what happens in Georgia, and all of that is going to serve as well as our backdrop. Notice you got Skinny Bones, which is her nickname, and the Hick, which is him. And then on page 246, we come back to the story itself, right? That is to say, on the day that Kennedy is shot. Let's say 3 things about now the end of the story. Notice the different responses. First of all, there is De Palma, the PE teacher, the gym teacher. And you have these kinds of teachers in every school, don't you, that are kind of stereotypic. He's the one that gets called in, etc., etc. Notice his response. 2 things. 1, he's blowing snot. He's crying so hard. A really subtle moment for your notes. He spits because he's crying so hard. He spits. And one of the kids says, gross, right? His response is interesting. He says it on 247. The president is dead, you idiots. I should have known that wouldn't mean anything to a bunch of losers like you kids. Go home. Now there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on here. You can read between the lines. What is it that he's saying to these kids who he considers to be losers? And why is it that he says, I should have known that none of this would matter to you? The assumption is what? Well, kids that, for example, who are kids of color, obviously you get the sense here, they don't care about America the way he cares about America. I should have expected this from you losers. Already we are kind of set up to the idea that different people have different views of other people, even though we're all Americans. That is to say, racism. So already this story is going to introduce to us this notion of racism. But notice it's done very subtly, right? Very subtly. Of course, when the kids are told they get to go home, their response to the fact that they get to go home is, yay, we get to go home, school's out, yay, yay. Elena, of course, knows, I should be feeling a certain way about the fact that the President of the United States has been shot. But she's going to go study with Eugene. She's a little more excited about that. In other words, we might say this at 2A, that we have a tendency when we're children to live in our own world and to not fully be able to appreciate the events of quote-unquote history or politics. I mean, you could jump down to 3B and you could remember a time when adults in your home were either really upset or really excited and happy about some political event.